Hello, my name is Ambient, and I know in the community lately there's lots of talk about mushrooms and fruit people and grass people and turf people and all these things. And when it comes to Zoro, I know it's a very popular opinion that's starting to grow is that he is ultimately a fruit. And this video we're going to get into how a fruit and a swordsman become a demonic entity king in the One Piece world and the truth behind all of that and how exactly it's been used to turn Zoro into the Lawnmower Man of the World Tree. And I have said many times on my channel that swords are words. Take off the S from the front, put it on the back, sword is a word. Well, just like Roger with traveling the Grand Line and getting to the end and realizing he had to go backwards, that is just one level of the clue, looking at the beginning and the end. Just like the logo, how the O has the straw hat and the end is an anchor, all kind of referencing that the straw hat is a dream catcher that keeps you trapped. That is ultimately just one, side of the clue, and there is a whole nether shadow world going backwards. So there's the look at. That's one other layer. There's at least two other layers, but for this one we're just going to be going into that one mainly. And in its simplest form, that just means looking at everything backwards. And when it comes to the word sword, backwards, it is DROWS. Now, I think there's a very real possibility that that's a huge reference to draw and drawing, and that the sword is a pen tip or a G pen tip with ink on it, and that's what every single sword in manga looks like. But I actually think that for Zoro in particular is much deeper than that, and we're going to be getting into that in this video and much more. Looking at why exactly Zoro has been grown from the beginning to be searching to slay Dr. Vegapunk. But of course, as always, that doesn't mean anything like what it sounds like. And I want to start out this video by giving a big shout out to Parvision. I know he's got lots of videos about mushrooms and mushroom people and tree and fruit people, and we're going to be getting into some of that stuff. Him and I have come to a lot of the same conclusions because I think we're both kind of past the fake layer of clues, but a lot of this last layer, I think, of clues are very up for interpretation, and they can go kind of all over the place and wild. And while we may be saying on the surface some of the same things, I think very different reasons for why Zoro is a fruit or tree or moss person. And we're going to be getting into that directly right now. And also, of course, quick shout out to Dax Saki's and his new video about the Afro tail and the Afro kind of being the key to One Piece, because I actually am going to be talking about that directly in this video as well, as far as kind of undead dreads go. And in this video, we're actually going to directly answer what I think that Grim Reaper thing that happened with Zoro and Wano when he was dead and all that stuff. We're going to answer that directly and much, much more. Please stay tuned for the whole video, and if you haven't already, please like and subscribe to the channel. We just hit 300 subscribers, which is so cool and huge. Thank you so, so much. Hopefully the next 300 subscribers are fantastic as you first 300. Thank you, thank you, thank you. And if you don't subscribe to the channel and hit that notification bell, you can't be programmed and sent these messages in videos the same way that Zoro is, unless you subscribe and all that stuff. Now, of course, even if you do, I guess it's not something that's ingrained in you at birth to, kind of force you to grow a certain way, but we'll get to that. And I'm going to touch more on what I got right and wrong in my last Vegapunk video in the next video that I'm doing about Vegapunk, but in this one, we're mainly just going to be focusing on Zoro and Robin and what exactly this whole scene was going on here with meeting Vegapunk and him knowing who they were, and, of course, what and why Zoro is seeking after Vegapunk to ask him a question. What that question is, why he's asking it, and ultimately all of what that stuff might mean. And just to kind of prove that I'm not super totally lost and crazy, that Dro word, the sword backwards, the swordsman thing, all that stuff, well, Dro is a fictional race of dark elves in the Dungeons and Dragons games. I also think it is a big reference to the Demon King Piccolo, mainly because this whole word does mean troll, but it mainly sources itself etymology-wise from Draug, which I mentioned one form of it in my Luffy's Real Dream video, but this is another form of it. And it's the Old Norse word for delusion, mirage, or illusion, and mainly meant a ghost, spirit, or an undead creature. Now, what's really interesting, though, is that it also meant in a poetic sense from the tree trunk, a man or a warrior, or just a dry wood tree trunk, which are all things of when we first see Zoro, he's literally attached and growing out of a crucifix cross thing of wood that actually grows when he gets off of it. And that might sound super crazy, but I think that there's a huge argument to be made that Zoro has kind of been creeping in the background in the shadows of the story since page 1. This character right in the middle of page 1 when Roger's execution is the same as Zoro's haircut and color. We also kind of see him at this first scene inside Party's bar. And then if that wasn't enough, all of Captain Morgan's kind of stuff, his hair looks the same as his. And a lot of that fight seems like it's almost like Luffy 100% deciding not to be a Marine against Captain Axe-Hand Morgan, but Zoro's kind of the one ultimately making that decision at the end of the battle. And I think on a very crazy level, that's because I think Zoro injects himself into the story and Luffy's life here, like ink from a pen.
Do you have an audition yet?
Oh, no, I'm not in the group yet. No, I'm afraid I just blew myself.
And after doing a few simple tests where he gets Luffy to kind of come and help him and kind of help the devil in a sense who's locked up here, he ultimately does get Luffy to 100% choose this form of his shadow creature instead of the Axe-Hand Morgan version of the shadow creature. And all of this relates to bog and moss creatures from old Irish folklores and all of that area. Same with the Vikings. They all had these kind of Lord of the Coast, so to speak, which were pine trees that lined the coasts of Ireland, and they were known as nightmare trees or nightmare pines. And I believe that all of that has mainly been funneled through Robin and Zoro into the story. And I believe that that's why mainly Robin and Zoro are focused on meeting this Lilith version of Vegapunk here. The two of them are highlighted and focused on mainly in this scene. And while I believe that Robin and Frankie are main aspects that have grown and been made out of the Tree of Knowledge from Ohara, and that's going to be what I talk about in my big Halloween video. And it does almost kind of seem like the chapters are starting to line up to what my video schedule is and kind of some of the big reveals I have planned coming up too, which is really, really cool and extremely helpful. So thank you, Oda, as always. And so first, let's kind of touch exactly on what exactly Roronoa Zoro is. Now, when we first meet him, he's one of the only characters we've ever seen that does not have one of those name tag things that shows off. And I think that's because he is kind of a shadow moss creature that can kind of change shape and change form into whatever he needs to be for the story. And specifically, I think that Zoro is related to something from Irish folklore called a moss person or moss folk or a moss loot or wild loot, which meant wild folk. All of it kind of being related to goblins and demon creatures from Irish folklore, which is actually the same thing that Piccolo is. And I believe that visually, especially when we first meet Zoro, the similarities between the Demon King Piccolo Jr. and Roronoa Zoro are, to me, extremely obvious. And now, in the Irish myths, these moss folks were literally known as demons, which Zoro's been known as the Demon King, the Demon of Hell, all of these things. And then going back to the idea that we met Zoro on a cross and all that stuff, that it may or may not have gotten bigger once he was taken off of it. But in German folklore, these moss people, demon creature things, would hide inside trees, and these trees would be marked by hunters by etching a cross into the bark. And according to the Grimm brothers, part of this tree process with the moss people thing was because they were extremely attracted to all types of trees as ultimately a symbol of the forest and forestation and forest surviving and thriving and stuff like that. And I do think there's a possibility that Zoro may be related to many of the huge Green Man myths and horned Green Man god myths from in the past and pagan stuff like that. But I'm not going to be touching so much on that video. And I don't totally think that that is the role that he performs, considering that he has no horns and no symbolic horns. Unless, of course, we want to count his swords as the horns. And I think that that may be an actual thing where without his sword, Zoro is this demon king, and then with his swords, he is made into a kind of human-saving Green Man god, fertility rebirth thing. But more on this specific aspect when I come out with my own Mushroom and True Mushroom King of One Piece video coming out later this month. But for this one, before we go into what exactly Zoro is asking and why he's asking it to Dr. Vegapunk and why he wants to meet him, the reason I think that Robin is so highlighted in this scene as well is because I think that ultimately her and Vegapunk might stem from the same source. That source being the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, one aspect of that or one half of that maybe being the Ohara tree of knowledge or the nightmare tree Ohara. Frankie's new bounty also lines up to the Demons of Ohara chapter, and I think all of it is kind of a reference to maybe the cobbler inside the tree as well as the spirit inside the tree, both kind of manifesting themselves in the real One Piece world. A little sneak peek of my Idea Evil video coming out around Halloween is, in shadow, you can see Frankie in the Ohara tree when we first see it. And I promise you that that is 1000% real, and I can prove it, and I will prove it in that video coming up.
Tear down those walls! Okay, you get this wrong one more time, I'm segregating the school.
And before we get too lost in the sauce with that kind of tree and craziness stuff like that, I believe that the fact that this Vegapunk thing is split up into 6 separate parts, I think is all to represent kind of the 6 different parts of a tree. The leaves, the twig, the branch, trunk, the roots, and the crown of the tree, all working in conjunction together to be one being. I think Vegapunk is very, very similar to that. And I think that even extends to, like how a tree uses light and transforms that light into usable energy and power, I believe that Vegapunk might be doing the same thing with light and star energy. And kind of along those same lines, I've been saying for months that we have entered into the androids and cell saga of One Piece, and I believe that this Logic, Shaka, Dr. Vegapunk, Punko, one body thing, the helmet is a huge reference to the great Saiyaman, and maybe even Bondru from Made in Abyss. But coming back to this video, I think that that is actually what the main thing that Zoro's kind of here to talk about, and that's spirits that might be trapped inside of things, mainly his swords. And as always, I think there are multiple levels of what's going on, and there are different layers of truth and falseness, and we're going to be getting into all of them right now. Now, on the surface, I think that all of the clues are pointing to Zoro asking about the spirit inside of his new sword, Enma. He's holding Enma here. It's kind of highlighted in this panel up here. And I think that Zoro either A, wants to have the will removed from Enma, 2, wants to talk to it, or 3, wants to have a devil fruit inserted into one of his swords. Now, I think that there's many reasons that Zoro is asking this, and something that he's always been grown to ask and be attached to, being his swords and the spirits inside of them, I think is kind of the main one. And I believe it all kind of relates to how, like, you know when you plant a new tree to make sure it grows straight and strong and true, straight up, you put like either a stake or a metal cage around the trunk of it to make sure, you know, that beginning stages of the growth aren't crooked. I believe in a very real way, Zoro's swords act as that same kind of growth highway or growth director for him to go, and you don't have to look much farther than his dreams or pointing up when he loses the Mihawk with his swords. All of them, I think, kind of point to the idea that trees naturally grow up, and they actually grow up because of being able to sense the magnetics and going straight up or whatever, very akin to a sword. And I believe that all of these sword references in the world map and everything here all might be signs to the idea that symbolically in One Piece, swords are kind of used as that kind of a crazy symbol of trees growing true, and that just means, you know, straight up towards the sun. And as much as Zoro's 3 different swords seem to signify that, I think the more important representation of that on Zoro is his 3 earrings, or his 3 bearings, which conveniently disappear whenever Zoro is doing morally questionable acts or is just straight up questioning anything. Zoro's earrings disappear. Check it out in the manga, I guarantee it. You'll be shocked. One of the first videos I was actually planning on doing for this channel was kind of how Zoro and Luffy complete each other, and this earring thing was a huge sign to that. Now, it eventually led me to the idea that Zoro was actually a plant or a moss person, so I kind of had to stop it because the whole video kind of got too big, but we're slowly coming back to all that stuff now. And for Zoro, like all characters in One Piece, I believe that their kind of natural instincts are being used against them. And Zoro, I kind of think, has been turned into a lawnmower man against his own kind. All maybe relating to the old Japanese myths of bamboo cutters or grass cutters, and how those all kind of tie into ideas and aspects around the Grim Reaper. And that Grim Reaper thing we'll kind of touch on in a second, because I think it kind of deals with Zoro's other 2 swords. And one of the definitions of his sword, Shushui, is to draw water, which I think may all be a reference to either taking water from cactuses or straight up just, you know, drawing water into a tree itself. And a lot of the Shushui Chinese characters and stuff like that all kind of lead to ear and hand. And I believe that Zoro kind of being a big reference to Inkaido from the Gilgamesh stories, and how that also means ear, as does actually the official Viz translation of Zoro's name being Zolo. Zolo means ear mainly as well. May all be a big clue for endgame stuff in the One Piece story, and in particular his relationship with Luffy. And that is actually ultimately where I think that maybe that Grim Reaper thing that showed up in Wano when Zoro was like quote unquote dead comes from. Is either the Shushui sword or the Wado Ichimonji. Now, the Shushui, another Chinese character definition of it, is to take and to fetch, to get, to obtain, to receive, or to select and to choose. And when you read into Thriller Bark a little bit more, and check out my Being Saki's a Trap video after this one for more about this aspect of it. But I believe that Zoro getting this sword from Brook and Ryuma was all a huge part of this One Piece plan, and ultimately pretty much giving the lawnmower to the Lawnmower Man, maybe. Equipping him with the necessary tool he would need to cut down the biggest tree or the world tree at some point in the story, which I think is ultimately what Zoro's trap might be.
No, you cannot joke about that.
Yeah, that's not funny, Arthur. That's not the kind of humor we do on this show.
Okay. I'm sorry.
When I was talking before about those moss creatures or the green man or all that stuff, all of them always kind of deal with what's known mythologically wise as the Great Hunt. The Great Hunt. And Zoro being a bounty hunter or part of a bounty hunting group that not only hunts its prey, but builds up its prey to be the most fat and ripe to pick in order to make it the highest bounty and all that stuff, I believe is a very real sad possibility for the future endgame of the story.
Please, Mr. Hill, loud is not allowed.
What the? Loud is not allowed? I work for a living. And I mean real work, not writing down gobbledygook. It just makes me want to... Oh, God, it just...
Hi?
Honey, bring me my BC headache powder and a glass of water.
All right.
Now, I don't ultimately think that Zoro will choose that. I think that he's been programmed and grown to do that, but I believe that he may ultimately make a choice of either self-sacrifice or saving Luffy. But this Grim Reaper figure coming out of one of his swords in Wano, I think that that was probably one of the main plans set forth from chapter 400 or so when we first met Ryuma and Brook and all that stuff. That eventually they would go to Wano. That was pretty much assured during that arc. And that once they got to Wano, maybe the spirit would unlock itself from the key of the sword, whatever. And when we use some light magic to look through those panels, we do see that Zoro's missing eye is cut out by this Grim Reaper looking thing, or at least it can be interpreted that way. And I believe that that's either a sign that something is either getting taken and removed from Zoro's programming, or I think much more likely something's being stitched in and implanted and weaved into his psyche in this moment. And now I think that Zoro has no idea about any of that stuff, and I do think that the most important aspect of Zoro is that when he faces life or death, he chooses to protect that white sword over his life, which I think is his point as a carrier of that sword, and why he was chosen by that sword to take it to a destination. And I do think that actually he might learn the truth about what's inside of that Wado Ichimonji sword of his. But I believe that he's mainly here because he thinks whatever that Grim Reaper thing was came from his Enma sword, which I do not think is the case. But I do think that Enma does have a spirit inside of it. And that's kind of the other possibility what I think is going on, is that in one of the recent SBSs, Oda kind of showed that Zoro would never have a devil fruit, but his sword having Kaido's kind of dragon fruit thing, or fish fruit, whatever, would be super, super cool. And I do wonder if that idea was implanted by the Grim Reaper here, and that's what Zoro's here to ask about, is either getting the will removed from Enma, or having it fed a devil fruit of some sort.
Get me a vodka rocks.
Mom, it's breakfast.
And a piece of toast.
And I was kind of showing some things earlier about Zoro relating to Piccolo, and it's kind of one of like the most stupid, obvious kind of clue thing jokes I think that Oda's doing. When I mentioned earlier those Moss people or Moss folk, well, in German they're known as the Moose Lute or the Wild Lute. All of those kind of having that lute word. Now, it's not, in this case, pertain to the meaning of it being a flute or a lute, but I believe that you can play around very easily with the idea that lute and lute being a flute, all of that being a reference to Dragon Ball's Piccolo, the Demon King of Hell Piccolo, originally. And I think in a very real way, Oda is reweaving canon to have an ending of Dragon Ball where, you know, Piccolo and Goku's final fight at the 23rd Tenkaichi Budokai is the end of the series. Kind of all centering down to a Luffy versus Zoro showdown to end the series, maybe.
I love all my children equally. I don't care for Joe.
And then obviously I think there's a chance that this Grim Reaper thing comes from the Enma King of the Underworld sword itself, but I really am leaning more towards it being a combination of all three swords or keys needing to be arranged together, utilized together. One person being able to use three swords in and of itself is a miraculous feat, so I believe that that's rare enough that it might be what's needed for this combination to kind of unlock itself. But either way, I do 100% think that whatever Zoro's asking, it's all about his swords and either putting wills in them or getting them removed, and that could be included in the idea of putting a devil fruit with a will inside of it. And I think this also kind of ties into this idea that if Zoro is some sort of a fruit or a devil fruit embodiment thing, all a fruit tree really wants to do ever is just grow as tall as it can and reach towards the sun. And I think all of Vegapunk's imagery seems to represent, you know, something running towards the sun and then having something cut it off, which is what all of these little Saturn ring things seem to represent. I think all kind of tying into this Lawnmower Man thing. But now, tying back into kind of the title of this video and this whole Zoro and Guts Dragon Slayer thing is Zoro instinctively, whether it's been the wanted prototype one-shot monsters or it's been in the story itself at Punk Hazard, Zoro has instinctively slayed every single dragon he's seen. And I believe that that's all kind of a fake clue for this Lawnmower Man thing, and how Zoro might be have implanted in him this idea of wanting to cut down or shave down the biggest tree, and Vegapunk may actually be the embodiment of that tree. And Zoro doesn't know it yet, but he's kind of been sent there as an assassin. Now, I am not saying that Zoro's aware of this. I think there's all sorts of clues all around the story of characters still being asleep and needing to be awakened and enlightened and all these things. And Zoro, especially with his one eye closed and the whole part 2 of the time skip and stuff like that, I think has had something inside of him locked away that his swords are the literal key of. And that maybe through whatever means that Zoro is trying to ultimately strengthen his sword may actually result in him kind of cutting down this biggest tree in the world. Now, the biggest tree, to me, would kind of block the sun from the world. So it could be a good thing, or it could be a bad thing. I think it's all going to be mixed and stuff like that, but I do ultimately think that Zoro is here asking about the Enma sword, but he will find out the truth of kind of the wills that have been stuck inside of him and kind of injected into him through these swords. And part of that kind of deception, I think, is also tied to that drag where I talked about earlier. This is a clue that's actually from A Song of Ice and Fire and Game of Thrones and all that stuff too, but that drag word, drag and dragon, the dream on, drag meaning dream or apparition or whatever, Draug-ON all being like a dream on, like a dream of dragons, all that stuff like that. Well, going back to all those swords words and the draw backwards being the dro and it being a malevolent undead being, that tro word that it all stems from actually originally meant to trust or to believe. And I think all of that is kind of in the One Piece world. The strongest characters gain your trust and then betray you. Which, if you look into the real life history of many, many pirates, the name of the game was basically betrayals and backstabbing and even betrayals by countries they were working for originally, and false claims of amnesty and stuff like that. And with that, my name is Jinrakai. Thank you so much for watching. Please comment down below what you think of all this craziness, and if you think that if Zoro isn't a moss or a tree person, what you might think he is. I'd love to hear all of your ideas about what exactly is the truth behind Zoro, whatever it is. My name is Jinrakai, and I will talk to you all later. Bye-bye.